before I do it. So I, I'll just say I'm a pastor of a church, a New Life Church in Laurel, Maryland, a church planted together with a colleague of mine, sister in Christ, Pastor Shalita Fambi. And so pastor there. And I met Dr. Reeder while having an amazing opportunity to serve as her pastor while I was in Philadelphia before we moved here. And so my matriculation into pastoral ministry came after I had been working in the broadcast journalism profession for some time since the call of ministry. And so I actually was working at Channel 2 in Baltimore. I was a director of new media there and made transitions to go back to school. I was fortunate enough to get into a wonderful institution in Northeast Princeton. And so I went there where I got my Master's of Divinity degree, and that brought me to the Northeast. And I began to do internships kind of in the area, which led me into pastoring in the area at the Church of the Redeemer in Philadelphia. And again, I am now where I am here pastoring in Laurel at New Life Church. So that's a little bit, I guess. Is that okay?
That's fine. Thank you, Pastor Amari. Dr. Clinthia?
So greetings, Pastor Amari. I learned a few things about you that we might have a couple things in common, but I am Calinthia Dowdy. I'm the Director of Faith Initiatives at Philadelphia Fight Community Health Centers. Longtime academic, spent 25 years teaching in Christian colleges, both Messiah College and Eastern University. My undergraduate degree was from Temple University back when they used to call the program radio, TV, and film. So my original dream was to get into media.
Hey.
Mostly filmmaking. That was, and this is when the technology has changed over the years, but that was my original dream. I actually ended up, after college, working for a church. And that is the thing that led me into ministry. I was a youth pastor for many years. I grew up in a Black Baptist church in Philadelphia. And so ministry was not unusual to me. This was back in the day when we were fundamentalists, we were evangelical. I was involved in tract ministry, going door to door, knocking on people's doors and giving them tracts. Jesus loves you and has a plan for your life. I mean, I still have it memorized. So I grew up with all that. And so when I became a youth pastor, it was fun, it was enjoyable. But that is the thing that led me to seminary. So I kind of tossed media out of the way and went to seminary, Westminster Seminary. And after a few years I graduated from seminary, but after a few years, I decided I no longer wanted to study God in that kind of way, but I wanted to understand people. So I eventually went on to get a PhD in cultural anthropology. And I bring those worlds together in lots of ways. So that's a little bit of who I am and what brings me here today. So thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Real quick, Dr. Dowdy, what's so funny is I wanted to be a film major too, but Hampton did not have I got my undergraduate work, did my undergraduate work at Hampton. They didn't have a film department, so I majored in the closest thing, which was broadcast journalism. I just wanted
Wow, okay, all right. We got to talk sometime.
Yeah.
Thank you both for sharing your background and your interest, common interest you have. So with today's topic, the title of this webinar is on systemic racism and the exploitation of Christianity. And that's even a heavy title in of itself. So I wanted to take the time to contextualize some of these terms, right? To kind of provide a distinction between Christianity versus religion and spirituality, and distinction of systemic racism versus white supremacy. And so I'm going to ask that you, in your own words, based on your own perspectives and experiences, let's start with providing distinction between what is Christianity versus religion versus spirituality.
Okay, all right. So today I think our talk is focusing on Christianity, which is a religion. I think, and the way that I understand the difference between religion and Christianity is that they're wrapped up together. That religions are organized institutions, and Christianity is one of them. You know, they have rules, they have presuppositions. It's a community agreement upon how we, upon our rituals, our rites, rites, and how we agree to live this thing out. Whereas spirituality, which is growing, more people identify as spiritual now, is in my understanding a bit more loose, right? There's no, it's not organized in that way. It's not an institution. It is more of a person's particular journey and how they connect with God or the creator or the gods, whatever the situation may be. With spirituality, folks, they could try to reach God through meditation or through nature, through the arts in some type of way. Spirituality is more individualized. Not that there can't be groups of people who are into spirituality, certainly there are, who connect together, but it is more individualized and I would say more free, quite frankly. It doesn't have the rules and rights and so forth that religion has.
Thank you.
Pastor.
Yeah, so I would agree in many ways. I think that, so if I was thinking about like a big funnel, and so it goes from wide to narrow. And so at the very top, you have this idea of spirituality, as Dr. Dowdy mentioned. And so it's very wide. So there's any number of persons who may embrace meditation, mindfulness, who may embrace any number of different spiritual practice. Some people will even lump in various types of yoga into their that spirituality lump. And then you kind of get a lot more focused when you get into religion. And as Doc mentioned, you have various rules, you have various systems. These systems and rules are often very geographic in their orientation and in their origin. And so there's now much more, in my personal opinion, there's much more of a historical emphasis on repeated practice of how we've engaged God as a collective community. And there's this passed down knowledge of here's how we choose to engage God as a collective community. Here's how we established our norms. So what you see is spirituality transitions into religion, and in doing so, it begins to become institutionalized, right? And then at the very base, in for the sake of our conversation and the sake of your question, you have Christianity, which, as Dr. Dowdy mentioned, is actually a religion. And what I would emphasize for me, pastorally, when I would talk about Christianity as a pastor in a congregational context, I would say that one of the things that Christianity emphasizes uniquely, and I think that that's important because each religion has a unique emphasis, right? One of the unique emphasis of Christianity is relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ, right? So relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. Here's where things can get tricky. And here's where I see an interesting kind of confluence of ideas for the sake of our conversation today. Because then if my relationship with God is through my faith in Jesus Christ, then who Jesus Christ is matters. Who Jesus Christ is matters. The personhood of Christ matters just as much as, for me, being a person of faith who ascribe to Christianity, as my understanding of the divinity of Christ, because his personhood, his historical personhood, who is this being that is serving as intermediary between me and God? It's really important. And I wanted to lift it up for the sake of our conversation today, because, and we may touch on this a little later, so I hope I'm not like putting the wagon in front of the horse, but things can get really complicated if you are able to define who Christ is in a way that excludes, and in a way that demeans, and in a way that puts down others. And unfortunately, what's happened historically, and this ties into our conversation today, is that's exactly what's been done. An image of Christ has been created. And again, who he was matters. My mind naturally gravitates towards the work of Black liberation theologians. I've been deeply impacted, and so I'm very biased. One of my favorite theologians of all times is Dr. James Cone. I've read everything he wrote. And the work that he did in focusing our attention on the historical Christ, who he literally was, a Palestinian Jew, brown skin, likely looked much more like one of the terrorists that we're afraid of than the person that we see when we go to many households with blue hair and blonde eyes. Understanding who Jesus was, who this individual was that serves as an intermediary, is critically important for our understanding of the faith that we say that we embrace. And so I only mention that to say, you can already begin to see how Christianity, because it is so particular, could be used in order to oppress, in order to marginalize, in order to subjugate, if you define Christ in a way that's not authentic to who Christ authentically was based on our understanding of studying our scholastic achievements up to this point. We know he would be a brown skin, very likely brown skin, again, Palestinian Jew living under Roman oppression, who probably could identify existentially much more easily with the plight of oppressed peoples like us historically than people who have been historically in places of power. And so for me, Christianity, my understanding of my faith stems from my understanding of who Jesus is, both as the Son of God, which is a belief that I embrace as a Christian, but also as a historical person who God chose to manifest himself as. And I think both of those are equally important.
Well, I thank you both for offering your perspective and understanding of the differences of Christianity versus religion versus spirituality, because you hear a lot of narratives from other people based on experiences or things that they may have learned or been a part of in their life. And so I think it's important to contextualize that so we can have an understanding that people may have different viewpoints or understandings, even to the degree of misguided information, depending upon what they may have been a part of. Culture differs, things like that. So I think it's important to identify that those constructs as we look at the exploitation of it. And so let's now move into the other construct of systemic racism versus white supremacy, so that we can kind of have this discussion about the exploitation of Christianity. So what is your understanding from your perspective of systemic racism versus white supremacy?
Systemic racism and white supremacy go hand in hand. So systemic racism is built upon white supremacy, or white supremacy has created systemic racism. Systemic racism was created, or it has created systems and structures that uplifts and supports whiteness, right? So within all systems, whether it's an education system, a healthcare system, housing systems, these systems support, even prefer, even oppress or repress others who are not white. So these systems support and uplift whiteness. Whiteness becomes normalized. Whiteness becomes the standard. So that even when folks talk about something, well, there's, normal people, most people are talking about white people, right? So this normalization, this standard, and white supremacy says that whites are superior to all other racial groups. And I want to add, especially Blacks, right? Because this is we're talking about anti-Blackness in this series, that whites are superior in every way to all other racial or ethnic groups, especially Black folks. So everyone who isn't white must try to fit in. This is the way it works itself out, right? Everyone who isn't white must try to fit into white norms, white standards, white culture in order to get ahead, in order to move ahead in life. Right? So when we talk about things like classical music or ballet, right? Classical dance, we're talking about Europeans, right? We're talking about things that are lifted up as the best, the supreme. This is the best because it is white. That is white supremacy. And these are the ways that white supremacy creates these systems and structures. I mean, education, right? The ways that we learn, it's very German, right? Germanic, right? So we don't even think about it at times. We do think of these things as standard, as normal, but it is white supremacy at work. And when it's at work at its best, it's doing what it does, and everybody just kind of falls in line as if it is the standard, as if it is normal. Even policing, we see it right now, right? That is systemic racism at its very best and very worst.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I was looking for, I'm in my office, so, which is always a bad thing because I have books all around me that I can grab. But I was thinking too, when Dr. Dowdy, when you were talking about music and white supremacy, I remember listening to an interview that John Coltrane did. And I think he was on tour, he was in Japan, and he was being asked, they said, man, so John, do you like classical music? Have you ever explored or thought about exploring classical music? He said, I play classical music. He said, it's called jazz. And I think that is just an amazing kind of insight into exactly what white supremacy does. White supremacy suppresses that which is non-white, really non-white, not just Black. Uniquely, I think in this country, has been uniquely focused on persons who are of African descent, Africanized people. But white supremacy really embraces a belief that we see now being embraced by the alt-right movement in this country, which is that we are a superior race. We have to protect our race. We are a higher race than others. And I would even offer this, that even the idea of race is a construct of whiteness. Okay. I really try not to use the word. I tend to use the word ethnicity, just because whiteness. J. Cameron Carter does a lot of work with this in some of his work on race and theology. And he talks about even the idea that there is a distinction based on the color of skin is a uniquely European construct.
Yeah.
And so white supremacy, I think she's talked about that beautifully, nothing more to say. For systemic racism, I would just offer that there are systems that are at work, and I think system is the key. And like most systems, when they operate in their most efficient state, you don't notice them, right? So like when you get into your car and you want to drive, you don't put a key in anymore. You push a button now, but you push a button or whatever that is, the ignition starts. There's a really advanced system that begins to operate, and you only notice the system when something's wrong, when it's broken, when it's not functioning properly. But when you properly change the oil, when you keep your car as it should be, white supremacy has fed into systemic racism in this country in such a way that it has been so well taken care of that it operates so smoothly that both whites and Blacks who are impacted and affected by the system do not know it and do not recognize it. And that's why the work that's being done now to bring up this idea of being anti-racist is so important, because it requires me to say that which I naturally am entitled to, I'm choosing to no longer be a part of, and to embrace a stance that would help me to fight for those who are being oppressed by the very system that gives me certain benefits. So one thing, systemic racism benefits whiteness. Right, there are benefits for people who are white in systemic racism, but the other thing that I would say is it's very historic in nature. I was reading an article that was put out in the New York Times about my hometown. I'm originally from Richmond, Virginia, and it was about redlining policies that were put in place. Redlining is, of course, when lenders would decide to not make investments in certain neighborhoods because they were Black neighborhoods and they were considered to be risky investments. And this was practiced throughout this country, for years, up until the 70s in very harsh ways. In the 1930s, this was really done very heavily in Richmond, Virginia. This is a great example of systemic racism. It was really, really heavily done in Richmond, Virginia. And so what happened was, when city planners were deciding where to plant trees and where to invest in more infrastructure with sewage and where to put more green spaces, they didn't do it in communities that were believed to be low income and not worthwhile investments because they were Black. And what the article did was then give us a flash forward to present day. And don't you know that in these communities, in the summer now, these communities are still occupied by Blacks primarily, and the temperatures in these communities tend to be 12 degrees higher at times than they are in other places as a result of the temperature being so much higher. Not only is the temperature higher, but the access to parks is diminished greatly. And so you have people who are living in low income environments who don't have access to air conditioning, who are now in places where they are struggling and dealing with the things that were put in place long ago as a part of a system, right? As a part of a system. They simply were born into it and they don't even know how it got there.
That's
I
right.
think that's a really great example of systemic racism, if I could. Sorry, Doc.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's a beautiful example. That's a fantastic example. And I like your car example too. Two things I wanted to add. I think it is important to understand when we're talking about anti-Blackness, yes, white supremacy sees itself as superior to all people, absolutely. But that if you look at some of the interviews done by white people, especially in the 50s and 60s, right? One of the things that often came up in some of those interviews was how different those white folks felt from Black people. That things like, they're just so different, right? So this is where colorism comes into play as well, right? But if I'm Black and if I'm chocolate Black with woolly hair and a wide nose, right? I'm so different. I can't be anything like them. You know, it's this thing. This is why I think this is why the Black piece is important to highlight. Yes, white supremacy lifts itself up above all other people groups, but this anti-Blackness thing, I mean, it is a very, it's some other thing. It's just, that's why I was glad Dr. Tashina had this series. I just thought this is a real thing here. So I'm grappling with that. I guess.
You know, the word that came to my mind when you were describing that thing was insidious. You know, systemic racism is so you may not even see it when it's happening, as Pastor Martin mentioned it, and it can be vicious on some level, depending on the situation and how you're experiencing its impact. And so I want to take a pause to check in with the audience. I know that we gave some kind of contextual understanding to what Christianity is versus spirituality and religion, and also some context to systemic racism and white supremacy. And I can imagine some feelings may have emerged. And so what I'm going to do is open the chat and just allow you to share your feelings as to what came up for you during the course of hearing those kind of terminologies and kind of contextualizations of its meaning. So feel free to add your feelings in the chat, and we can identify what may have come up for you in the chat box. If you have any thoughts, feel free to, chime in. Emotionally drained, frustration. Yeah. I think a lot of that is going around, especially during this time of COVID and being home and having to see things now on TV and social media, confusion, ditto, feeling the same. Yeah. Angry. Yeah, and those feelings are valid. And I want to say that having this series was not so much to hear more of Black stories, but rather really calls you to ponder and think, whether you're Black or white or from another culture, to think about systemic racism and its impact on Blacks, but also the others, right? What does that mean? How are we upholding some of these narratives that maintains these systems? Sorry for being late. Okay. Opening old wounds, not healed. Yeah. Kids don't know they're taught. Yeah. Frustrated. So I thank you all for sharing that. And it sounds like these are some kind of deep emotions you're experiencing. Unfair. Yeah. And so while you're feeling these emotions, I'm going to ask that you practice some of those techniques I showed you in the beginning, some deep breathing if it's becoming a bit overwhelming for you in terms of your feelings, okay? So I would like to go to the next set of questions. Now that we've identified, we contextualize some of these constructs, I think it's important to think about the historical context of systemic racism and Christianity, of how it's been exploited. Because I think what happens oftentimes, I don't know about you, but I've heard folks say about Christianity that it's a white man's religion, you know, Jesus wasn't white, or you're brainwashed. And I personally don't believe that Christianity is that in terms of what people are claiming it to be because of their own past hurts, or messaging they've learned. So I think it's important to kind of talk about the historical context of how systemic racism weaponized Christianity, specifically when speaking of Blacks in our history. So I'm going to read this question because it's a complex question and I don't want to miss it. So I'm going to look down and read this question. So I'm going to ask both Pastor Mari and Dr. Dowdy to answer this question. Historically, can you speak to how systemic racism weaponized Christianity and how it continues to exploit Christian messaging in 2020? And the impact it has on the perception that Christianity is a white man's religion.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. Doc, you want to kick off?
I can. I'm pulling up my. I went back to I said I have to go back to 1452 if I can read this short quote, because this comes right from a pope. It's the papal bull, Doctrine of Discovery, if you've heard of it, and you can Google this. Goes back to 1452, and it is giving direction to folks who are, it's time of discovery, Christopher Columbus and other discoveries. And so here is the Doctrine of Discovery that comes from the church. This was the Catholic Church at the time. It was the only church at the time. And this is in quotation marks. I'm just reading a part of this. So, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ. I have to read that again. Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, whosoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever, held and possessed by them. So whatever these pagans hold and possess, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Perpetual, reduce those pagans, whoever you find in your discovery of sailing the seas and looking, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. That's stealing, for one. I'm just going to be nice about it. But this comes from Pope Nicholas V, 1452. This is a decree from the church supporting, when Chris Columbus goes out there and other explorers, when you go out there and you run into these people who are heathens and pagans, they're not like us. They're not good Catholic Europeans like us. Take everything they have and make them your slaves. Sit with that for a minute. The papal bull, Doctrine of Discovery, that comes from the church, and it's using Christianity. It's using Christianity.
I think that in addition to that history kind of that Doc just read, it really demonstrates in a quasi way another concept that one of my missiologist professors at Princeton, Dr. Daryl Guter, described to us. He talked about Christianity. He's actually a wonderful missiologist. I love his work. And Dr. Guter talked about the transfer of faith from one community to another, one place to another. And he said Christianity, when it is properly being translated, when it's properly being transferred, it's a seed, right? It's a seed. It's placed in soil, and then people who are there are given the ability to nurture that seed, to water that seed, to grow that seed so they can grow up in its proper context in that given environment. That's the way that he describes transfer of faith from one location to the next, ideally, as it pertains to Christianity. What he then went on to say was that unfortunately what happened during periods of European exploration was that they did not show up with a seed. They showed up with a plant already potted, already decorated, with a set of instructions on how that plant had to be cared for. And that they then handed that fully grown potted plant off, placed it in a context that was completely foreign, and told people that they had to utilize it and to deal with it there. I say that to say what happened with Christianity, and one of the reasons that it became so oppressive and such a major tool when it comes to racism and the way that it's been used historically, is that the persons who were in control of the transfer, the persons who were handing it off from one community to the other during key periods were European peoples. And when they came, they had the ability to define Christianity based on their understanding, whether that was factual or fictional.
That's right.
They had the ability to describe and to define Christ, who Jesus was, based on their understanding or their desires, whether that was factual or fictional. That's why we could just say, we're going to totally get rid of who we know Jesus was historically. We're going to replace him, as I said earlier, with blonde hair and blue eyes. We're going to make up an image of what he looks like. It's completely made up. It is like completely made up, right? Mm-hmm. And then we're going to hand it off to people, and we're going to tell them that this is God, and we're also going to force compliance. The other thing that happened with this kind of transfer that was also very deadly and is also very dangerous is this idea of language, and this idea of creating a system where there's an inability for people to explore Christianity and explore faith for themselves. And that was practiced by the Catholic Church for years through Latin. And so historically, every Catholic service or every liturgy that was written in Catholicism was in Latin. The priests spoke in Latin. And what's amazing about that is that common folks had no idea what was being said. They did not know. They couldn't understand what was being preached to them. They had no idea what was being said. They were just told to accept it, right? That these were not just Black common folks. I mean, Black, white. Dr. Laman Sana from Yale does his work in this area. He talks about translation. In fact, one of the things that was considered to be heretical at the time was the creation of the King James Bible, because it was put in common language, was put in common English, so that anyone, not just a priest, could pick it up and could engage it. So when you have Christianity being put on people, the symbols that are used to define Christianity and the history that's used to define Christianity is being controlled by a set of people. And then they give you a Bible that you can't even approach, you can't even read for yourself because the language has not even been translated into your own. All you can do is accept their word for it. Now, let's say that you have the Constitution within yourself to say, you know what, something doesn't line up here. I'm not going to accept this. Unfortunately, not only did they show up doing the things I just mentioned, they also did what Dr. Dowdy mentioned. They also showed up with cannons and guns pointed at heads saying, okay, well, listen, you have one or two choices.
That's right.
You can either choose to accept everything that we've said. Jesus is this way. Faith looks like this. We are the Imago Dei, the image of God, the idea that we're all created in God's image. We're going to toss that out. White people are, you guys are heathen. You're going to accept what we've said, or you're going to die. Over time, even if people are initially going to say, no, I'm not going to accept it, as you can imagine, people are people.
Right.
And so people have to now make a choice for the sake of surviving, for the sake of my daughter, for the sake of my wife. I'm just going to say yes. and I'm going to comply. And as time goes on, historical truth gets lost and replaced with fiction. This is a really high level, and I'm being very ambiotic intentionally, but it kind of describes why it is that people in this country believe oftentimes that Christianity is a white man's religion, because it was handed off by white people, by post-enlightened white Europeans.
A version of it.
Exactly.
Handed off.
A version of it. And I would even say this, the version that is oftentimes found even within the Black church has traces.
Yes.
Has traces, elemental traces of this. Now, what we love to do is, Black people, we know how to flip anything. You can give us a ham hock, the most worthless portion of a pig, and we will do something wonderful with that thing. And so our people, because we are ingenious people, because we are creative people, because we are innovative people, because we are brilliant, and because we are God embodying people, once we got into a position where we could begin to make certain decisions on our own, begin to do certain research on our own, we got to a place where we were able to say, no, some of this doesn't make sense. This doesn't line up. I'm tossing this out. We're going to keep this. I'm going to take this. I'm going to keep this. I'm going to take this. But unfortunately, a large part of what was handed down in terms of the traditionally practiced Christianity in this country has its roots in that oppressively used form of Christianity that was used to subjugate people by whites historically over time. And that's why it's so hard for people of color to oftentimes say, I can ascribe to this faith, because they see it as synonymous with the persons who were translating it. They see it as synonymous with the people who were in control of it. They see it as synonymous with the persons who were, and if we can, I'm sorry.
And they were often not wrong. I want to say, so with the question, is Christianity, or has Christianity been presented as the white man's religion? And my response is absolutely.
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 Version of it has.
Yeah.
One of the things that Howard Thurman, I love James Cone, also love Howard Thurman, a Black man, 20th century theologian, a mystic, probably one of the earliest Black mystics in this country that I'm aware of. And his well-known book, Jesus and the Disinherited, he writes in that book, he attempts to make a distinction between what he called the religion of Jesus and religion about Jesus.
So good.
The religion of Jesus is good and pure and peaceable, but religion about Jesus has been co-opted by whiteness. Absolutely. We've got to make these distinctions. And even, and this is where folks get a little angry with me, my Black folks who I love dearly, in the churches I grew up in get a little angry with me, because I want to critique them too, right? I'm not just critiquing white supremacy and its takeover of Christianity, but also how many Black Christians have, like you said, we know how to turn a phrase. We know beautiful worship theology, but often at the root and foundation of what you find in a lot of Black churches is still white supremacy, and particularly as it relates to male supremacy, right? They picked up on that one and carried that flag, but it is still there too. And so until we can get to a Christianity that really looks like the life of Jesus, which is not oppressive, right? It's not about political oppression. It's not about social domination. It's not about elitist privilege, but it is about a value and a love and equality for all people. That's Christianity.
And the thing that I would say too, I fully agree with everything that Doctor said. I think that for me, even my time at Princeton was amazing. I went to obviously an institution that's a historically white institution. I will say this though, they did a wonderful job when I was there, based on my professors and the experiences that I had, of giving me the tools that I needed to really pull back some of what we're talking about and to do some critical discovery. And I was able to, because I had access to education, because I was given the tools to go back and to learn for myself, because I was given the ability to read texts in other languages and to study for myself. what I was able to do was to go back and see the difference between this pure, this idea that Dr. Dowdy is using, this pure Christianity, this Jesus is, I would say, the Christianity of Jesus. I was able to see where that is and distinguish between it and polity and practices that have been put on top of it or dressed it up by Catholicism, by whiteness, and by Europeans when they got faith in their hands. That's what they did. They dressed it up and they made it look like what they wanted to. And one of the things that's so important, I believe, is for people to continue to have access to education so that they can find out the truth for themselves. I'm really big as a pastor on not asking people to do something that they do not understand. That really matters to me. It matters to me. Why are we doing it? Why am I asking you to do this? You have a right to know. Even if you don't care to know why, I want you to know why, because I don't want you to do things for me. Now, we may decide to keep a practice that we inherited from Europeans, right? We may decide, okay, you know what? We know this came from Europeans, but we're going to keep this practice. But we need to know so that we can actually make informed decisions and eliminate those aspects of the faith that are actually oppressive in nature from those that are actually purifying and life-giving in nature, if that makes any sense.
Amen. Amen.
You know, as you guys were speaking about this issue, I was pondering on a few thoughts about just the buy-in that not just Blacks, but other cultures have into systemic racism. And we don't really realize we're brought into this kind of the benefits one to receive from systemic racism. Case in point, you mentioned about the access men may have in the faith, in the faith community. Men are upheld as superior, and then there's in some places pushback about women leadership. Now I know we progressed, you know, leaps and years, but some places it still exists. But
That's
this
right.
privilege that may have stemmed from the origins of systemic racism, we don't even realize that we're upholding that. And this is why I was saying early on that systemic racism can be really insidious in nature when we don't even realize how other cultures benefit from it, or how we are upholding and using it to oppress others for the benefit of our own motives or interests or what have you, which falls into a place of having, and this is just my own opinion, having such conversations as this as being difficult, right? We don't want to acknowledge the benefits we have obtained because of how we're upholding systemic racism, because it's uncomfortable, because then it means we have to look at ourselves and say, I do that too, or I have a way of oppressing folks too, using maybe the faith or whatever privileges we may have. And so I think this, I mean, I'm glad we're having this conversation. I know, I recognize having this conversation is not going to resolve it, but it will make people think about things, right? And so we are almost at 2:00, and I do want to check in with the audience. I know this is a great conversation. I believe this is fruitful. And I know the audience are probably wanting to share some of their thoughts and feelings. So I'm going to open up the chat for those who are in attendance to chime in about their thoughts and feelings that they're maybe having based on what you've heard thus far. So please feel free to use the chat box to express your thoughts. Okay. So maybe we're just sitting with our feelings. That's fine. If you don't have anything to say, that's fine too. But you do have room to ask your questions in the Q&A box. Feeling like I just been taken to school, powerful education. Will this Zoom meeting be? Yes, the Zoom meeting will be available. It helps to talk about. Yeah, I think sometimes we shy away from having these types of conversation because these topics are sensitive. People have feelings and have loyalty to their own belief systems, right? And it's hard to have these conversations, but it's beneficial. I believe Black people are identified because of white guilt. Wow, that's powerful. and again, this is not to, we're just having conversation, not to talk about whites, but just give you some historical context of how systemic racism exploits Christianity. My pastor is the truth. Oh, so you have a guest, Pastor Mars, the truth, important information shared from all. You have to find your truth. I would like to thank Pastor Hughes on speaking to language. So people they're appreciative of you speaking to the language. And
I think he went to Princeton too. The person who wrote that.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Pastor Hughes on speaking to language. It takes me back to a symposium I took with Dr. James Combs and the African Heritage Study Bible. Language does matter. Thank you.
Somebody wanted me to do the papal bull again. I won't do that. I can say, you can Google that, but I do have another quote if we have time at the end. Frederick Douglass.
Okay. Okay. So we're going to come back. I'm going to save some of these comments in chat so we can try to look at some of the comments before we close out. But I'm going to go to the next set of questions so we can allow for time for question and answers. So we've said a lot. We said a lot of things that definitely caused me to ponder about my own beliefs and things I may have done that kind of stemmed from a form of oppression when working, in social services, when, we have to adhere to, this maybe speaks to the systems that we may have to work under in the capacity of our roles. And so it causes me to even think about some of the policies and procedures created that perpetuates these things. Case in point, I remember working at an organization where we shied away from people exploring or practicing their faith, right? And so they allowed for Bible study, but didn't allow for for those who are Muslim to pray, and it didn't allow for other religions to do practice their faith. And while that was part of that organization, it was oppressive to other people who had differences of opinions or faith that unfortunately led to some people leaving services because they felt that they were being mistreated. And I think this may speak to a lot of what happens in different platforms or organizations where faith becomes the vocal point of people wanting to exercise their beliefs. And so I think that also evokes emotions and not knowing how to navigate that. So here's another question. So Pastor Murray and Dr. Clinton, I know you guys are both do things outside of Pastor, you're a pastor, Dr. Clinton, you work in the community. Can you speak to how, because I know oftentimes when things happen, crisis happens in our community, whether it's local, whether it's regionally, nationally, the faith community is oftentimes called upon to do something in the light of what's happening that speaks to one's faith. And I think oftentimes the faith community or the lay workers are often overlooked as to how they're also impacted by what's happening in the world. So can you speak to that in terms of the faith communities are expected to do something when, a crisis happens in our world?
Sure. Should I go, Doc, or
Sure, you take it. Yeah.
All right, okay.
I want to hear from the pastor.
Okay. Well, I first of all, I appreciate the framing of the question in that it makes room for members of the faith community to experience the trauma as well. And I kind of wanted to mention that because I can just be honest right now. Like I'm at a place where after what we just had, happened with Jacob, this brother being shot in the back 7 times. Like I'm at a place where I and my wife and I, we do this in our home. I may watch the news like for 30 seconds during a day. I don't even know if I don't watch it as much. I just will pull up whatever's going on my phone and kind of scroll through, because seeing the same things over and over again is traumatizing for me too. And I would say, for me, one of the first things that I try to do is actually deal with the experience of the trauma for myself. So like, before I can respond, I have to first deal with how it's impacting me. And I just wanted to mention that because I think that sometimes faith leaders are critiqued for their response, lack thereof, and it's done in a very unempathetic way. And what I mean by that is there's no consideration. There's sometimes very little consideration. My wife tells me, don't ever talk in absolutes. Sometimes there's very little consideration given for the fact that maybe somebody is not moving yet because they're recovering from the trauma that activity, that event has caused for them to experience as well. They've experienced that too. And so I just wanted to create that baseline. Yes, pastors serve, and yes, pastors are leaders, and yes, pastors are in some ways ambassadors of God within given communities, but they're also very, very, very human, a 110% human, just like you. And so what's happening in our world, what's happening in our community, it hits us emotionally, it hits us psychologically. We get depressed too, we get frustrated too, we get angry too, we get mad too, we lose our tempers too, we feel helpless too. And I think making room for that will hopefully create more compassion when we begin to critique people for what seems to be a lack of activity. When I am in a position, once I've kind of experienced and once I've recovered, and I also mention this as much as I possibly can because I want to do what I was getting ready to mention. I talked to my therapist about it. I sit with her, go through it. I just kind of mentioned that because I want to also, once I'm able to recover from it, use whatever platform I have in order to shed light on that experience and shed light on what's happening. Before we even take any action, we have to create awareness, right? So if that's my social media platforms, right? If that's an announcement during church service, if that is, I'm invited to speak somewhere. What I love is what Chris Paul right now is doing. He's the leader of the Players Association in the NBA, and he's taken such a wonderful stance against the injustices that are being done in the Black community in terms of police violence. I watched him getting ready to be interviewed after a game he played a couple of days ago before they just went on boycott. And when he was asked about a play that he made in the game, he literally responded to the announcer and he said, I don't want to talk about the play. I want to talk about the young man that was just shot in the back 7 times. He was using the platform that he had in order to try to create awareness. Yeah. After we create awareness, I think what we try to do is to take action. And for me, that action as a pastor always starts locally. And it works its way out from there. So within the congregation that I serve, how can we take action to meet need that's now present within the congregation because of whatever has happened? Then we move out to the community. Within the community that I serve, how can we take action and how can we partner with other organizations in larger community and even nationally to kind of move through certain things? So that's kind of what I move through, but I wanted to just lift up, initially the fact that we endure trauma too. We struggle with what's happening too. We wrestle with it and question God about it too. And I think that's important for everyone to hear.
Thank you, Pastor Mari. I appreciate you mentioning that. That's exactly where my head and my heart went when Dr. Reeder asked the question. Early in the pandemic, back in March, I was meeting via Zoom. We've been Zooming for a while now with quite a few faith leaders through various groups that I'm a part of in representing Philadelphia Fight, and then also my own faith communities. And one of the things that I noted in those conversations were that these were people who were pastors or who were leading faith communities in particular ways, in unique ways. And folks, this was a pandemic. People just did not have answers. And clergy were feeling very depressed. For the first time, it was kind of like, I don't know how to respond to this. This is the first time this is happening in my lifetime. How do we can't see our parishioners. We're told not to have service. We're told to social distance. And a big part of being faith community together is being together. is the ability to hug one another, and share some of our deepest, most intimate life issues. And we can't do that. And so that was very depressing for a lot of clergy members. They didn't have answers, answers about how we can end this pandemic. They didn't have those kinds of answers for their faith communities. And so we were meeting together kind of as a safe space to deal with our own unknowing and our own depression and our own uncertainty, because we are humans. We're dealing with the same trauma, the same issues. And so clergy meeting together was really significant for the first month or so. And some people are still meeting during this pandemic. And then with the racial uprisings, folks started going outside, putting on masks and saying, we're marching, and so trying to be present, but still be safe. And it was just difficult, right? But I think it's important that we use our platforms in ways that show that we can be vulnerable, that we are vulnerable, that we have feelings too. And that some of the despair that some of our faith community folks might be dealing with, that folks know that, that's okay. We're not going to live into that despair. We're not going to stay there, but to have that feeling is expected. Yeah. So I think in community spaces, I'm not pastoring a church, but in community spaces, I see my role as being a presence, hopefully a soothing and calming presence. I don't try to pretend I have all the answers, but I do know that one of the things, oftentimes folks aren't looking for answers. Folks are looking for folks who they can be with and who they can trust in spaces where they feel safe. Yeah. So I try to roll in that kind of way. Just to be there, to be a presence, and to be a community together. Yeah. And we've just had to figure out different ways of being together during this pandemic.
Can I say one more thing too, Dr. Rita, if that's okay? I also found, and this has been something that kind of has happened in the preaching that I've been doing more recently. I found, and I felt called to, if I could use that language, and hopefully that has resonance with most, I've felt called to, and I've seen great benefit in also giving people hope. Yes. Like just giving people hope, not promising things that we can't promise, not trying to create false hopes by saying, oh, it's going to be over, it's about to end, oh, things are going to get better. I mean, even, I hate to say it, I'm not trying to make this political, but even about November. I mean, even about November. I mean, I can't come to people and I can't say definitively what will happen. But what we can do is continue to create space for hope. Hope that things will, I think hope is one of the most important things for people to retain from a soul perspective. I really do. You've got to remain hopeful. You've got to remain hopeful. When there are times when you may feel as though you lose your faith, but hope will bring you back to a place of faith if you can remain hopeful. And I think that's so very critically important that we give people opportunity to be hopeful. And I would say this last thing very briefly. I found that despite all we've been through as a people, one of the ways that I'm often able to create hope within particularly environments in which I'm talking to members of the Black community, of my community, of our community, is that, my God, look at what we've been through already.
That's right. That's right.
If we've made it through the Middle Passage, we've made it through systemic rape, we've made it through Jim Crow. Even right now, there are concerns about the vaccines that are being created. And I was talking to a colleague saying, well, we've been through the Tuskegee experiment. We understand that. We've been through so much. And if I was in a church setting, Dr. Rita, I would say we've come this far by faith. And because we've been through so much already, because based on my chosen belief system, God has brought us through so much already. I'm able to come and I'm able to say, if he did it before, God can do it again. Forgive me for language that may be jarring for some, but I just wanted to to mention that, because I think that that's one of the greatest calls that I've sensed as clergy and as a member of the faith community in this season. It's just, man, keep giving people hope. Remind people we've overcome so much.
Yeah.
Overcome before we can overcome again.
Thank you for that, Pastor Mark, because that actually brings me to our last question, which is more so some recommendations or offerings that you or Dr. Dowdy may have to the community, whether you're white, you're Black, or from other cultures. You talked about hope, having hope being important. And so one of the questions was, what could you offer in terms of what people can do to support the cause of healing and cultural inclusivity, almost like the salad bowl kind of concept we often use to identify our individuality, but be remaining hopeful even in these times of hardships that we're experiencing?
I think I think it's important that we educate ourselves. So if folks ask, I'm always giving out recommendations for books, videos, blog sites, where we can educate ourselves, right? I'm not going to assume that just because I said something that you were going. Matter of fact, I get lots of pushback, but that's okay, right? Because I think this is a lot of this is difficult, right? When I think of my faith, I mean, I grew up in the Southern Baptist tradition in Philadelphia, a Black Southern Baptist fundamentalist evangelical church. We were very conservative. And so when I began to, kind of metaphorically dance with some of these ideas, it was just kind of rattling. And to even begin to realize some of the ways that I have been oppressed in my own thinking was difficult. So I realized it can be difficult stuff, and that it is a process. Yeah. So you don't just read one article, you don't just go to one webinar, but that it's a process. And I think if people choose to engage in that process, they will find it fruitful. If I want to also lift up anti-racism training. I am an anti-racism educator, been doing this for 20 years. We've been doing 17 years, but been doing this this was at a time when folks did not even like language, not that they're fond of it now, but language like white supremacy and white privilege. And folks like, what are you talking? I had a white guy in the training ball up his fist. He was ready to punch me out. I had to step back 2 times. I was like, wow, he caught himself. But this was how angering this kind of material made people back in the day. Yeah. The folks still get angry. But I'm a part of a group called Roots of Justice, and we're actually beginning to do our trainings online because of the pandemic. So starting in September, it's a 20-hour anti-racism dip and dive. And I think we're one of the only ones who have a faith analysis. That might not be true, but I think we're one of the only ones who have a faith analysis within our, so we were designed for people of faith. And then through doing that, we actually began to do it for other people outside of faith groups who began to ask for anti-racism training years ago. So we're getting quite a few calls now, but I recommend it. I recommend check out Roots of Justice, rootsofjusticetraining.org, and we also have a Facebook page. But again, educating, books, sitting with people who do this work, who are in it, and having conversations that are real, because what we often think of as normal is not normal at all, right? It is a way of life that has been imposed, a way of life and thinking that has been imposed upon us, and is detrimental to folks. It's not only detrimental to folks of color. White supremacy is also detrimental to white people. This is not normal, right? So it's important to talk about that as a white person, this isn't a healthy thing to think of yourselves as the center of the universe, or as normalized, or as the standard for all humanity. So all people, I'm not just talking to folks of color right now, but white folks as well, who are very damaged by this kind of thinking. So I recommend, I have a few books. I don't know if you want specific recommendations, or if we could put those in the chat. I usually only recommend about 2 books at a time, because I think that's enough. And also some films that you might watch on that are on Netflix or Amazon Prime. So I don't know how you want us to do that, Dr. Reader, but I have
recommendations of books in the chat so that everyone can see it. Yeah, it's fine.
Did I cut you off, Doc? I don't want
No,
to.
I think I'm gonna start putting this stuff in the chat and listening to you too, my brother. So
Okay, and I'll do the same. I have some books that I would recommend, and some similar things. I was thinking about a couple of things. So one, conversations are so important. I know not just but conversations both with persons that are outside of your community and persons within your community. And here's where I'm really talking to my white brothers and white sisters. I know, like you know, that there are conversations that happen within the white community when brown bodies are not present that do not happen when brown bodies are present. Now, you know that, and I know that. I also know that there are conversations that happen within brown body communities that do not happen when white bodies are present, right? So these things happen in both locations. And I think it's really important when it comes to racism that we take the time to challenge racist thoughts, to challenge racist notions, to challenge racist ideas that are present when people who would need to be defended are not able to defend themselves. One of the things that happened as a result of white supremacy and white racism in this country is that there are certain places where Black people just aren't, that we just aren't there when it comes to being executives at certain levels. I know that we have some wonderful executives in major places, but by and large, we're not owners. I was listening to, again, I was watching ESPN yesterday when they were talking about the boycott that's happening right now in the sports world. And I think it was Jalen Rose, one of the commentators, who asked the question. He said, how is it that you can have a league where over 75% of the players in the league are Black, but 99% of the owners in the league are white, right? The decision-making power is power that we oftentimes don't have. What do you do, my white brother or my white sister, when a resume comes across your desk and you see a name like mine, Omari, right? What happens inside of you? You just be honest. And do you give my resume, would you give that resume the same read that you would if the name was John? Now, my last name is cool, it's Hughes, but the Omari, when you see Omari, when you see or when you see Aisha, what do you treat that resume in the same way? I was watching Oprah Conversations on Apple TV and she has this new show, and she brought on Emmanuel Acho, who is a player who's started this YouTube show called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. It's wonderful. I would recommend that you check it out. And one of the things that he was doing when he was talking through that, they would bring on white people who would not mind sharing, hey, I've been in this position and I don't know what to do, or I didn't do anything. Should I have done? And we can all do something. We can raise our voice. We can share. Particularly when people are not present, fight for them. The last thing that I was going to say though is this: take the time to learn more about the communities that you're not a part of. Part of what we haven't talked a lot about in this particular conversation is white privilege, right? Because white supremacy is one thing. White privilege is its own monster. White privilege is a monster, is a monster all of its own. Mm-hmm. And what white privilege does is afford white people the power to not have to know, right? You don't have to know how to interact with certain aspects of the Black community. You don't have to know how to talk. And when you can operate in American society and never really delve deeply into those places or those things. But when you don't know what's offensive. When you don't know what language is a trigger. When you don't know the historical use of certain symbols. You think that the Confederate flag really is just a symbol of your grandfather who fought for the Confederate Army. You may not really know that this flag represents the most barbaric level of racism that African Americans were dealing with at the time. You may not know that giving a Black child a stuffed monkey is not something that you want to do, because historically we were called monkeys. You may not know, but if you take the time to interact with members of your communities that are not like yours, you can learn those things that are offensive, learn those things that are triggers, and learn how to eliminate them from our vocabulary. In the same way that praise God, now somebody with some sense is taking away the Redskins from the Washington team. Native peoples have been saying this is like calling us the N-word. They've been saying that for years, but many white people just didn't listen. They didn't. I don't know if they didn't listen or didn't know it, but if you take the time to explore communities that are foreign to your own, oftentimes you can discover what those hidden triggers are. I'm sorry, I felt like that was very long-winded. Forgive me.
I appreciate both of your sharing of recommendations of how people can further educate themselves around systemic racism. I think education is very important. I think they say it's liberating. And I think when you learn and you become more aware, and then hopefully it will also inform new behaviors, now that you know something different. That's the hope. So we have a couple of comments. I just want to make sure people can see some of the resources that's been provided to you in the chat box. If you can see the resources, this type, yes, I can see them. So I can make sure you all have access to that and can use that. Just type, yes, I see resources, or got it, something affirming that you can see it. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Great. So I'm going to move on to the Q&A. And at this time, if you have questions about today's topic or what you've heard, please feel free to go into your Q&A box to ask your questions, okay? So we have, let me see, we have several questions. One of the questions was, can one have a cultural or racial frame of reference without being racist?
Can you say that again?
Yes. Can one have a cultural or racial frame of reference without being racist?
Oh, it's an interesting question. We can certainly have a cultural, I always say culture is created, but culture is real. It's more real than race. Race is a construct, but racism is still very real. I don't know, I guess I'm stumbling over this one a little bit because I don't know, anonymous attendee, who is this anonymous attendee? I don't know if we can have, we are immersed in culture and race. I don't know if we can have a frame of reference without it having some kind of racial overtone, but maybe it doesn't have to be racist. Some people would argue, though, that we are always on a journey of becoming non-racist, as if we don't really arrive, but we get closer, you know? So I think that because of being human, there's always culture, there's always ethnicity, there's always this thing that is a racial frame too, because we grow up in this. So can we have a frame of reference without being racist? I don't know.
I was thinking about that, and I don't know if what the person is referring to is, can I see color? And when they say race, I don't like the construct either, but maybe that's, so I'm going to assume. Let me operate based on assumption because we don't know. Mm-hmm. But for the sake of being able to respond in some way, shape, or form, I'm going to assume that what you're saying is, if I see color when I look at people, because I hear one of the things that people talk about more recently, and I'm sorry to everybody, the second book that I put up, Race a Theological Account, is by J. Cameron Carter, not by Robert Jensen. Sorry about that.
Okay.
But what I wanted to say was, more recently, I've heard people say, I don't see color. Not true. That's not true. Unless you're colorblind. And my understanding of being colorblind is you still see color. I'm sorry.
Breaking up just a little bit. You were freezing.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I'm very sorry. Okay, what I was trying to say was, can you see color? Oh, I don't, you hear people saying, I don't see color. No. I think they do see color. And I want you to, I want you to see that I am a Black man. I want you to see that that sister is a Latina or an Asian woman. I want you to see that they have brown skin and a wide nose and kinky hair. I want you to see that their eyes are more slanted and that their hair is straight and that their skin is of a yellow hue. I want you to see it, and I want you to accept it. And I don't want you to differentiate from who that person is because of it. I don't want you to demean that person because of it. I don't want you to assign stereotypical values to that individual because of it. I think that it's very problematic for us to say that we want to get to a place where we no longer see ethnicity. I'm not going to use the term race, because I think that our ethnic differences are beautiful. I love aspects of the Black community. I love who I am as a Black man. I love the fact that I have a Black grandmother. I love things that I've experienced in the Black church. I love the things that I've experienced as a part of a Black family. I love the food that we eat when we gather together for Thanksgiving and for the holidays. I absolutely love it. I'm a part-time vegetarian, but I take off for Christmas and for Thanksgiving because I love who I am. And to my Indian brothers and sisters, I hope you love who you are in the same way. And to my Asian brothers and sisters, I hope you love who you are in the same way. Forgive me, because I know we take India out of Asia because they're brown-skinned people. I didn't mean to do that in this conversation. But I hope it's okay for even white people to feel like that. But we get into when we start to demean others based on those differentiations, instead of celebrating them and recognizing our shared humanity. And I think that that is what I would want to push and what I would want to emphasize in response to that question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pastor Mari. We have just two comments. I don't know if anyone else have any questions, but you have comments of, this was such a viable discussion, and thank you for the story. Christianity as a seed versus a plant, depending on how it is presented. Really helpful frame. Someone else mentioned, I just wanted to say I enjoyed hearing everyone's views and opinions on this topic, which I definitely have my own as well. So it sounds like a lot of what you were saying resonated with some folks, but also enlightened others around this conversation. If there's any other questions in our audience, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box. We would love to hear from you, even if it's a thank you or a statement, that's fine. We have some time. If you have any specific questions to any of our guests, you can ask your questions in the Q&A box.
And while we're waiting, unless questions come through, if I could read a little bit of this Frederick Douglass quote, because you probably know this quote, but he makes some wonderful distinctions too. Is that all right?
It's fine.
So this is from, so again, the year is important, 1845, Frederick Douglass, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, wonderful read, but he talks about Christianity in here. He calls the Christianity he has understood as a slaveholding religion, right? That's the context he has seen it in. But he says, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels. And I could go on. I mean, the quote goes on. Clearly, Frederick Douglass understood there's something different here. Again, the religion of Jesus and religion about Jesus, Christianity of Jesus, or because the word Christian came after Jesus, right? But the faith of Jesus, faith about Jesus, two very different things. And Frederick Douglass gets on that as well. It's right on. I love the quote.
Gorgeous.
We have two comments. One is, we have some time. Thank you, Dr. Dowdy. What is the best way? So someone wants to be able to contact you. They're currently working at an organization on race, and they want to, I guess, get in touch with you.
Should I put my email address in the?
You can put your email address in the chat.
Yeah, you can reach me through cdowdy@fight.org. I'll put that in the.
Someone said they would love to see a part 2 of this topic. So Dr. Dowdy put her information in the chat box. So if you want to connect with her, you can access her information in the chat. Well said, but when I say I don't see color, I mean I see your color, your ethnicity. However, I don't have a prejudice against it.
Good.
That's great. To that, I would say wonderful.
Someone says, thank you for hosting this conversation. Please continue to stay safe, well, and hopeful. Just want to thank panelists and presenter for their time and information. Keep getting in good trouble.
Can I ask Dr. Rita, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I actually wanted to ask this of Dr. Dowdy, and I was looking at some of the other questions, some of the other things that were here. Dr. Dowdy, could you could you just share how you define anti-racist? Because I know that that's a term now.
Yeah.
It's become more popular, and sometimes people are utilizing it, but they haven't done the historic work in that area. Right. And I would so love to hear how a practitioner
like it's a contested term too. Like everybody doesn't agree upon it. My organization uses it. Some people say it deters folks from really getting involved. I don't know. I like racial justice, but I don't have strong feelings against anti-racism as language. But so we would say an anti-racist. So in some way, you know, your folks are racist, right? We won't get in who can, because that's another part. Who can be racist, who can't be. We won't talk about that now. But so that folks are always racist, but we can get on this journey toward becoming anti-racist, but that we live in a society that creates racist, right? And so the question is, can we ever can someone say, I'm just not racist. I am not racist. And the answer to that for many is, you can be anti-racist, meaning you're on this journey, but to just say, I'm not racist, is just not reality. So that's kind of, at least that's one understanding of what it means to be anti-racist. It means I see this thing, I have knowledge about it, I don't like it, I want to work against it, realizing that I have to always be doing my own work. By the way, we just had, we had our white guys talk last night. It was called, they named it, it was called White Men Missing in Action. And they're all four guys I work with, anti-racism trainers. And we did a live discussion last night, 8 p.m. It's still up if you want to look at it, but they were just wonderful. But they talked a lot about that, being on their own journeys. These are men who have been doing the work for a number of years. They were really good. They were honest, they were vulnerable. They talked about being white men and all that means and the problems often with that. Yeah, so up at the Roots of Justice website, I think there's another page that calls itself Roots of Justice too, but we're the one with the big tree.
Actually, that because I was in a webinar with was a presentation called "From Caring to Committed." I think they were from Roots of Justice too.
Oh, did you go to that one? Those were our white women.
Yeah, I attended. That was actually a pretty good webinar. It was
that one is still up too. That's up at the website. But that's my organization.
Oh, cool. I didn't see. I learned something new about you too, Dr. Dowdy. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that you can see the Karens. They called it moving from Karen to commitment.
So for the second time, we're at 2:30. There are a lot of people sharing in the chat, thanking you both for your presentation. Many thought that today's presentation was very thought-provoking and very stimulating for them. And so some of them are asking for part 2, which is good, that they want to learn more about this topic. And so I want to end today's presentation with thanking the both of you for taking your time out to share your knowledge and offer your wisdom about this topic, in hopes that it will definitely cause the seeds to be planted to inform change in the individual. As Pastor Murray and Dr. Dowdy, you describe it, going out, to the community, from inside to sharing and educating others. And so I appreciate the both of you. Thank you very much for your time. And for those who are still on the webinar, once we end and close out, you'll be prompted to complete a survey to share your experience of today's webinar, to give us feedback, and it will help us.
I have my fight cup here.
Plug to give your feedback about today's webinar and how we can enhance our webinar offerings. And stay on the lookout. The Community Health Training Alliance, known as CHEETAH, is also debuting our new programming called CHEETAH Chats, where we'll be interviewing half-hour presentation live, Facebook Live, Instagram Live, interviewing people in the community from all walks of life, sharing about resources to help folks navigate their way through this trying times of Corona, but also civil unrest, and just to know what's happening in the city of Philadelphia that you may be unaware of. So we're excited about this new programming and hope that you will be a part of that debut as well. So stay tuned to your emails, okay? Thank you both, and have an amazing rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.